Forest spirits. The midnight howl woke Michael unexpectedly. He was initially unaware, drifting into deep, quiet sleep after a busy week. Suddenly, he was alert, heart racing before his thoughts caught up. The room was chilly, with a draft from the windowsill needing repair since October. November air seeped through, tracing a line down his neck. He stayed still, listening to the house's usual sounds, the heaters tick and roof's faint creak. Almost dozing, he nearly closed his eyes again. Then it happened again. It wasn't loud exactly. It didn't shake the walls or rupture the night. It rose gradually, almost carefully, like something pouring into darkness from above, a long, wavering note that climbed and held, vibrating behind Michael's sternum rather than heard. He sat up. Moonlight through thin curtains cast a pale rectangle at the foot of his bed. He stared without seeing, listening as the sound faded into the trees. A wolf. His first thought was simple. Wolves sometimes roam the hills above Millhaven. The town nestled in a valley in northern Vermont between ridges of spruce and birch, with the forest harboring creatures that usually avoided humans. A wolf howling in November wasn't unusual. Michael knew that. He told himself so, sitting on the mattress edge in socks, rubbing cold hands. Still, he looked out the window. The yard was silver and quiet. His truck, frost-covered, sat in the gravel drive. The empty Route 9 had little traffic, especially late in the season after summer visitors left. Millhaven's population was just over 400. The spruce trees at his property's edge stood perfectly still. No wind, no movement. The world resembled a static photograph. He remained there for a long while, breath fogging the glass. The howl didn't return that night, but he stayed awake, sitting in the darkened kitchen with only a small lamp casting a yellow glow. He drank water twice, pondering the sound that troubled him, not because it was frightening, but because of its nature. Though he had heard coyotes and wolves before, those were sharp territorial calls. This was different, more like a question or grief than a warning or claim. He nearly laughed at himself for thinking that. It's just an animal, he reminded himself, probably a wolf making a sound. He returned to bed at 1:30 a.m. By then, the kitchen light had been on for 2 hours, and his coffee was cold. The next morning, he mentioned it to his neighbor mainly for conversation. Dave Kowalski, living across the street in a greenhouse with a snowblower on the porch, was straightforward and direct in tackling problems. He was splitting wood when Michael approached, his axes striking cleanly in the cold. "Yeah, I heard it," Dave said casually. "It woke Carol too. She disliked it." "Do you know what it was?" Dave added a log and split it in a single swing. "A wolf," he said, "probably rabid. A healthy wolf wouldn't come so close to the houses." He stacked the halves without glancing. "I'll talk to Ed Hargrove, and Jim Dawson will handle it." Michael nodded slowly. "Do you think it's necessary?" Finally, Dave looked up with a final, even-tempered expression. "Mike, it's a wild animal making noise near where people sleep at midnight. Yes, I believe it's necessary." Michael headed home, hands in his jacket pockets, contemplating it. The morning was bright and freezing, with a pale blue sky over the ridgeline. A raven sat on his mailbox, watching him approach silently, then took off quietly over the roof. He stood in his kitchen, gazing at the tree line through the window. That sound wasn't from a sick animal. He couldn't explain why he was sure, or tell Dave, but its deliberate searching tone felt more unsettling than any growl. He drank his coffee, watching the trees. The night after, at midnight, the howl returned, always from the north ridge near the old logging road, just like clockwork. As if waiting were decided in advance, the patient persisted. By the third morning, Michael no longer dismissed it as normal. By the third night's long call rising at midnight from the ridge, the village quietly split, those claiming sleep and those with bruised, tired eyes, including some older kids who looked sluggish and jumpy beyond algebra. When he wrote an equation on the board and turned away, 3 flinched not at the math, but at the squeak of chalk breaking in his hand, revealing the silent weight it added for them. After school, he lingered, straightening desks and stacking worksheets, as if neatness could steady his mind, but as he stepped outside, The early November twilight crept from the ridges. He saw trucks parked along Main Street near the town hall, their exhaust low in the cold, indicating others had thought of the howl and what it meant for Millhaven when the woods pressed in. With his collar up and breath streaming, he entered, immediately smelling old pine, dry wool, cold coffee, and cigarette smoke from the open-door people, sneaking a few drags before discussion. The low hum of voices echoed unevenly in the cramped room. Ed Hargrove, still called Mr. Hargrove despite retiring 10 years ago, stood near the front, calm and lined under fluorescent light, one hand on a folding chair's back. Beside him leaned Jim Dawson, in camo and orange cap, carrying snow-melted footprints, eyes narrowed, expecting trouble. More townspeople arrived, Dave and Carol in heavy coats, Linda wiping her hands, older men from the gas station, and Michael thought of the town as crowded into this lighted box at the edge of darkness, all standing close enough to force the outside problem to retreat. "Let's start," Hargrove said, voice clear through the overlapping murmurs. Seasoned by decades of meetings, we all know why we're here. There was a murmur of agreement that sounded more like a cough. The wolf, someone in the back said, and a few people laughed, but it was faint and quickly drowned out. Michael sat along the side wall near the coat rack, observing faces without being in the center. Jim stepped closer to Hargrove without waiting, his boots heavy on the floor. "It's a simple," Jim said, calm but loud, seasoned by years of speaking over noise. "We have a wolf coming close, comfortable enough to howl over our houses 3 nights in a row. Anyone familiar with those woods knows that's unusual, unless something's wrong with him. When a predator's off, you don't write essays, you act before disaster strikes." A ripple ran through the room like when someone shares common sense mixed with fear, and Michael's jaw tightened, uncertain of what he'd say if he stood. Carol raised her hand from near Dave, clutching her coffee cup with trembling fingers. "My boy's been awake every night," she said softly. "He keeps asking about that sound, and I can't just say it's nothing. It doesn't sound like nothing, and I want to sleep without worrying about what's in our backyard at midnight." Someone else spoke, Harold Mason, an older man who owned land on the North Ridge near the old logging road. "I found big tracks near my shed yesterday," Harold said slowly. "Not coyote. I don't like it." He looked at Jim. "I agree. Let the hunters handle it." Not everyone nodded. At the back, Jess, a younger woman who moved in last year and worked remotely from her cafe laptop, pushed her dark hair aside and said, "You don't know for sure it's a wolf. It could be a coyote or something else. Even if it is, it hasn't hurt anyone. We're in the woods, remember. Sometimes they make noise." There was a murmur, some agreement, some irritation, and Michael sensed the tension rising like a storm. Behind it, his thoughts shifted as if standing on loose gravel. He understood Jim and Harold's points. He didn't want a child or pet harmed by a predator. But the image that kept surfacing when Jim talked about taking care of it wasn't a snarling animal, but something in the dark, howling into the cold air, seemingly searching for something it couldn't find. Without realizing he would speak, he stood. "I heard it," he said, drawing the room's attention, some surprised. Others, relieved someone else, spoke. "I heard it all 3 nights. The noise is loud enough that ignoring it isn't an option. I'm not claiming it's harmless, but it doesn't sound like a mad animal or an attack about to happen, at least not to me. It sounds." He paused, searching for a word that wouldn't make him look foolish. "It sounds like something calling for what it lost." A few people shifted uneasily, and Jim's mouth tightened. "Mike, with respect," Jim said, "you teach school, not track predators. And whatever it sounds like doesn't change that if that thing decides to come down the ridge instead of singing, we'll be unprepared for the chaos." Before the silence could turn tense, another voice spoke from the doorway, rough and dry as old paper. "Not quite nobody," it said. Heads turned. Standing in the open doorway was Earl Whitman, his lean frame outlined against the darkening twilight outside, the brim of his canvas hat dusted with faint sleet. A park ranger for 30 years, age and a bad knee, had led him into retirement, but he still carried himself with the ease of someone more at home among trees than people. He entered, softly closed the door, then moved slowly across the room, the scent of cold air and damp wool trailing behind him. "I heard it too," Earl said, joining Hargrove without a chair. "And I've heard more howls than most here, I can tell you that. That sound on the ridge isn't a warning or a victory chant. It's something else." He paused, then looked directly at Michael with piercing eyes beneath his drooping lids. "At least he's right about that." Jim shifted angrily. "Whether it's different or not, Earl, are you going to tell us it's safe to let it keep howling every night until it does something worse?" Earl's gaze remained steady and unwavering. "I'm going to say we don't know enough to confront this like it's open season. That scream belongs to a lone wolf, not a pack, and a lone wolf doesn't abandon his family voluntarily. Something's wrong in his world, and he's trying to fix it. If we interfere blindly, we might worsen it." Michael felt some relief, not because Earl made it less scary, but because he shaped the unknown into a clear picture, a solitary creature in the dark trees, circling and calling into nothing. "What do you suggest?" Hargrove asked softly, tapping the chair briefly before stopping. "People are frightened, Earl. They want to sleep again." Earl looked at the tired faces, hunched shoulders, and Carol clutching her cup tighter every time Wolf was mentioned. "I suggest we give ourselves one night," he said. "We listen, watch, and look for signs in the morning with open eyes, avoiding ghosts, then decide. Let Mike and me go tonight to the old logging road, sit quietly at the tree line, and see what we're dealing with. If I say it's dangerous, you can send Jim and the whole county armed tomorrow, and I won't interfere. But if it's what I suspect, then it's not a monster, just something broken, and deserves one night's grace." The room absorbed the proposal. Michael's practical mind wanted to refuse, feeling he had no business wandering the woods at midnight in the cold with an older man, watching for a predator that may or may not threaten them. Yet the alternative, staying home and hearing that cry again as the town sharpens its fears into bullets, felt worse, like a surrender he'll carry long after the wolf is gone. Hargrove rubbed his jaw. "One more night," he said, looking at Earl, Jim, then across the room. "We give Earl and Michael a chance to see what's real. Tomorrow afternoon we meet again to discuss what they saw. Until then, no one goes wolf hunting without the town's approval." Agreed. Jim disliked it, his shoulders tensed under his jacket, jaw clenched, but he nodded sharply. "One night," he said. "If it keeps singing after, I'm done listening." Outside, daylight waned, windows dark and reflective, showing not the trees, but the room's tired faces, old floorboards, Earl's slim silhouette, and Michael's own uncertain expression, as if caught between town and forest, knowing neither side feels completely safe. By late afternoon, the sky had a washed-out metallic hue, signaling a sharp drop in temperature once the sun dipped behind the ridge. Driving home along Route 9, the bare maple branches looked like black veins against the pale sky. Snow in the ditches turned crusty from tires and cold wind. With each mile, the weight of his promise at the town hall pressed heavier on him, shaping itself inside for the night to come. At home, he moved slowly, uneasy in his stomach. He grabbed his thickest coat, dark green with a worn corduroy collar, still smelling faintly of wood smoke from a bonfire. Then he found his wool hat and heavy gloves that made his fingers clumsy but kept them from freezing. Testing his flashlight confirmed a pale beam that traced across the kitchen wall, revealing every nick and shadow, making him think how different that narrow light would feel slicing through trees and darkness than familiar drywall. He lingered at the gun cabinet in the spare room, hand on the key hanging above, torn. Growing up in Vermont, he knew going into the woods at night in November without a gun, when facing predators, sounded heroic in stories but foolish in reality. Still, something recoiled at the idea of walking toward that sound with a rifle, as if metal and weight would transform whatever fragile, strange thing might happen into a certain outcome. In the end, he unlocked the cabinet, took out the old firearm. His father had left him, checked the action and safety out of habit, then leaned it against the door ready if needed, but unarmed unless the night turned dangerous. Outside, a thin frost formed on the porch railings, the wood slick under his glove, and his breath appeared in a white cloud that lingered briefly before drifting toward the spruce's dark line. A light wind moved through the needles, resembling distant water sounds. The cold felt personal, slipping beneath clothing and down his spine, prompting him to wonder how long they could stand there before the chill dulled his mind and resolve. Earl arrived in an old blue pickup that rattled noticeably before Michael saw the headlights, casting shadows on the windows, creating an illusion of someone inside with a flashlight. When the truck stopped and the engine silenced, the stillness felt almost tangible, heavier than before. Earl carefully stepped out, breath visible in the cold air, wearing a low-knit cap and a loosely wrapped scarf more for form than necessity. "Got your layers on?" Earl asked in a calm, conversational tone, with a dry undertone indicating he expected perhaps an incorrect answer. "I think so," Michael replied, raising and then dropping his gloved hands, feeling self-conscious about his coats bunching in his boots, more suited for shoveling than walking through snow. "It's colder than I thought already. It'll drop another 10 degrees once we're in the trees," Earl said gently. "It'll feel colder if the wind shifts. Do you have a light?" Michael raised his flashlight and the rifle. Earl looked past him to the porch. "It's there." Michael nodded toward the door where the .30 leaned, its barrel catching a light. "I'd rather not use it," he said. "Good," Earl replied. "That way you're less likely to fire out of panic. Proceed regardless, night distorts judgment." The drive to the trailhead was under 10 minutes, but to Michael, it felt longer, like time stretching as it pulls you towards something your body protests. The sky shifted from pale gray to deep blue dotted with clouds, fading the last light unevenly. As they ascended the narrower route to the north ridge, houses faded behind them, replaced by dark trees and occasional faint glints of ice in roadside ditches. Earl's truck heater hummed, emitting warm air with a faint scent of coffee and pine needles. The wipers squeaked every few seconds despite a clear windshield, cold and invisible. Earl drove with one hand on the wheel, eyes fixed forward, the other loosely on his thigh. They stayed silent for a while, leaving Michael alone with his heartbeat and fleeting irrational thoughts. That the wolf wouldn't be there tonight because they looked, that it sensed their approach and remained silent, or that they were heading towards some other hungry truth about the world he never wanted to face. "Ever sit still in the woods at night, Mike?" Earl asked eventually, without looking. "Not really," Michael replied, pondering honestly. "Camping as a kid, but with others, a fire, noise. It never felt like this." "It won't feel the same up there," Earl said. "Most of it is mental the first time. Your eyes see one thing, your bones another. You'll feel darkness pressing, but it's just the same trees with no light. Small noises, branches cracking, movement will seem louder. That's okay. You'll notice everything, judge less, and avoid shadows, and listen intently." "For the wolf?" Michael asked softly. "For the wolf, and for what he's listening for," Earl said. "Predators only call like that if they care who's listening." Their park spot was a wider patch of packed earth beside the road, lightly dusted with snow crunching beneath their boots. The air was crisper, the temperature lower than in town, making Michael's nose sting as moisture threatened to freeze. Above the ridge, the sky darkened to a bruised hue. Early stars twinkled near the zenith, and black trees side by side formed a tangled web-catching faint light. They moved silently in the quiet, their footsteps loud on the soft snow, flashlight beams mostly focused downward to avoid startling glare from branches and trunks. The old road quickly narrowed to two faint ruts, then to a single snow line where deer had passed, the forest closing in with a smell of cold earth, decayed leaves, sap from broken branches, and a subtle wild scent of fur and muscle that might have recently passed through. Off to their left, a small stream, barely audible under ice, flowed quietly. Earl halted as the slope steepened toward the ridge, raising a hand to signal without turning. "Here," he whispered. "We leave the road briefly, aiming near the tree's edge rather than their center. If he climbs that rise to sing." They navigated between trunks and fallen branches, snow-deeper off-road filling gaps and hiding dips that made Michael twist his ankle, causing a sharp jolt of pain to remind him how isolated they were. Earl finally halted at a slight rise, the land descending toward the dark valley with faint town lights, like distant stars spilled on the ground. Sid, Earl said, settling onto a fallen log with slow joints, appearing more relaxed than Michael, who remained upright. We won't move or talk much now. We wait. Michael sat, feeling the cold through his jeans, the rifle between his knees, muzzle pointed away, safety on, fingers resting lightly on the stock. He kept his flashlight off, letting his eyes adjust, and after a few minutes the darkness transformed from a solid wall into a tapestry of faint variations. A paler strip where the snow on the old road caught the dim starlight, a darker patch where spruce trees blocked the sky, and the ghostly flicker of his breath rising. Time shifted into a different rhythm, measured not by minutes, but by heartbeats and the slow chill spreading to his toes and fingers. Sitting there, he became aware, unlike indoors, of his steady pulse and muscles tensing and relaxing with each twig snap in the dark. The forest was never silent, tiny sound snow scuttles, creaking trees, rustling branches layered into a background. Yet he listened for anything unusual, long, low, or oddly deliberate sounds. In that brittle silence, his thoughts turned inward, the darkness outside creating space for a darker, quieter region within. He thought about the town hall faces, about Carol's strained voice, Jim's certainty, and how his own words had sounded less confident but true. He was torn between wanting someone stronger like Jim to handle things and refusing to surrender to the cold finality of a gunshot, sensing that doing so would close an inner door he might never reopen. He didn't know how long they sat, their time had become slippery, but knew his legs were nearly numb and his jaw tight from clenching, just as he began to accept that perhaps the wolf had gone silent when Earl's hand, resting on his knee, suddenly tightened, fingers digging in. The forest seemed to inhale. Then a howl erupted from the ridge ahead, closer than ever heard from Michael's house, so near he could hear the wavering edges where breath and voice tangled, like being inside the creature itself. It rose from deep within the chest, climbed patiently to a painful peak, then slowly fell. Out here, with only cold air between them and the source, the sound hit him physically, raising hairs on his arms and neck. Within it, he again felt the absence of space where something should have been but wasn't. Up there, Earl whispered, barely moving his lips, eyes fixed on the ridge's crest. Michael looked, saw a dark shape against the sky's lighter band, the silhouette of a wolf with its head raised. Its long legs, erect fur, and calm stance suggested restraint, not arrogance or aggression. It appeared almost braced, like a person at a cliff's edge calling out. Earl's breath formed a slow cloud. Look at his posture, he murmured. No tension, no crouch. That's not an attack wolf, but one trying to stay together. Hearing this, the wolf paused, lowered its head, ears forward, sharpening its body. Michael felt his lungs tighten, sensing the animal's awareness of something new, perhaps a change in scent or sound, and realized it was them, their presence filling the air. For an instant, he thought it would bolt into the trees, leaving only the fading echoes of its notes. But the wolf remained, still and balanced, gazing at them without advancing. Its dark gaze fell across the distance, and in that moment, something lingered between the shadows at the slope's base and the ridge, a recognition that they had become part of each other's problem. The morning after the ridge night, Michael woke up aching all over, like someone had wrung him out and left him to dry in a cold room. His muscles throbbed softly with each movement. He lay motionless in the gray half-light of his bedroom, listening to the faint ticking of the heater and distant hum of a plow truck on Main Street. His mind briefly forgot why he felt so exhausted until the image of the wolf on the rise flashed back vividly, almost hearable in the dark among the trees. He pushed himself up, legs protesting, and felt the cold boards under his feet like the night sitting on the log had followed him home, settling into the house, While dressing, he sensed a subtle shift, a thin barrier between him and the forest had been pierced, allowing something raw and wild to seep into his ordered life. The wolf had watched him carefully before turning away, and though nothing overt happened, no growl or step, Michael felt a shift, as if the boundary between observer and observed blurred just enough to matter. He made coffee, his hands automatic, thoughts drifting. The mug's warmth did little to ease the chill in his chest. Outside, the sky was a clear, cold blue, with fresh snow blanketing the yard, hiding footprints but leaving fences, rocks, and tire tracks sharply defined. Light snow continued after they left the ridge, covering the scene, but leaving the memory of the log and rifle vivid in his mind. Earl's truck arrived as Michael was putting on his boots, its engine clanking and rattling in the quiet. When he opened the door, cold air hit him sharp and metallic, like it always did on late fall cold days. Earl stepped out in the same coat and cap as the night before, but his movements were tighter, shoulders hunched against the cold, and his purposeful stride suggested he hadn't slept well either. "Did you sleep at all?" Earl asked as Michael stepped outside, his words forming tiny puffs in the cold air. "Some," Michael said, which was close enough. "You?" "Couple hours," Earl replied, shrugging. "Body's less forgiving, but it remembers worse. Ready." Michael looked toward the tree line where snow-covered spruce and fir stood dense. He felt a mix of reluctance and resolve. "As ready as I'll be," he said, pulling his hat down and tightening his gloves. "Back to that spot." "We start where he was," Earl said, "then let him guide us. Like this snow, we should use it. Fresh enough to read, not too deep to drown. Today's perfect for truth." The old logging turnout looked different in daylight, still lonely. The snow in ruts and along the edges had been pushed aside in ridges by one plow pass, leaving narrow strips of white and churned brown. The trees, which seemed solid walls in the dark, now appeared as individuals, each trunk and branch distinct against the pale background, shadows between them soft but not deep. The air was colder than in town, dry and stinging inside Michael's nose, making his eyes water. He inhaled deeply, smelling cold earth buried under snow, distant wood smoke from a distant cabin, and a faint animal scent that made his skin prickle. They walked the old road silently, boots squeaking on the thin snow crust, their breaths loud in the clear air. Michael carried the rifle slung across his back in daylight. It felt less threatening and more like uneasy insurance. He kept touching the strap, reassuring himself it was there, even though he didn't want to think of using it. The light spread evenly through the trees, the low bright sun casting long pale shadows like fingers along their path. At the spot where they turned off the road the night before, Earl slowed and carefully stepped into softer snow, his eyes scanning the ground intently. The faint crunch of steps softened into a muffled sound, each sinking to slightly, as Michael sensed the forest familiar scent sap, bark, and the faint moldy sweetness of fallen leaves. The slope gently led to the ridge, thinning trees, revealing the flat crest where the wolf had stood against the sky. There Earl quietly pointed, indicating a snow patch with broken crust and distinct depressions, darker than squirrel and deer tracks crossing their path. "Come look, but step carefully, don't disturb what we're reading." He moved cautiously, like handling something fragile, placing his boots between tracks rather than on them, and Michael, clutching his larger feet, followed. Knees protesting, he crouched at Earl's mark and saw clearly a series of prints along the ridge crest, pressed sharply into the snow, with long straight strides forming a narrow path, as if an unseen weight had passed intentionally. Michael had seen dog tracks before, wandering paths made by neighbors' animals, but these were different. They moved in a precise line, with hind feet landing close to front footprints, sometimes deepening the snow rather than multiplying, creating a focused, deliberate track. "Big male," Earl said, crouching beside him, his gloved hand hovering above a print, as if reading something from the air. Notice the stride length and the toes spreading slightly as if shifting weight to one side. He's alone, no smaller prints or pack. Realizing these were the animal's pacing marks hit Michael hard, like uncovering a secret journal page. The prints weren't just snow marks, they formed a trail of worry, reflecting restless agitation that kept Michael awake, just in a different language. Why is he circling? Michael asked, observing how the tracks looped and crossed in white arcs within a space no larger than a small yard. Earl's face tightened. He's searching for something missing here, he said. He returns to the same spot where everything stopped making sense, checking if it's different this time. He straightened slowly, knees creaking, and looked downhill toward the slope falling from the ridge they hadn't reached in darkness. Tracks go down, Earl said. Let's see where he's headed. Descending was cautious and uneven, hiding rocks, branches, and soft spots under the thin snow crust. The wolf's prints led diagonally, deliberately avoiding icy patches and water hollows. Michael followed less gracefully, slipping and catching himself on saplings, snow falling onto him in his hat, cold running down his collar. As they descended, the trees subtly changed. Taller spruce gave way to smaller saplings, with a few pale birch trunks glowing among darker bark, their whiteness luminous in filtered light. The air grew stiller, the wind blocked by the hill, and distant sounds the hum of a plow. A dog's bark faded, until only their movement and melting frost drip remained. After a while, Earl slowed, eyes fixed on the ground, and Michael saw the wolf's tracks suddenly veer sharply toward a shallow hollow, surrounded by twisted roots and deep snow. Careful here, Earl whispered, voice lower, indicating the land's quietness. He's stopped here before. Michael examined the snow, noticing a scuffed, overlapped area where the wolf had paced or rested briefly, the signs of a restless presence. On the far side, under evergreen branches, was a shallow depression against a large spruce, with thinner, darker snow evidence of frequent use. Coarse gray fur clung to the bark nearby, and as Michael leaned closer, he felt a strange tightness in his chest, as if the air had thickened. Old Den Earl said softly, although not frequently used now, it was not long ago. See the fur in the packed snow, it could have been a resting spot for him or more. More, Michael asked, sensing the answer. She-wolf, Earl replied, examining the hollow surroundings intently. Pups, maybe, if the timing and his actions match. We're past their typical tiny size, but patterns and cycles can shift when something's off. He shifted carefully, then crouched and hovered his gloved hand over a smaller, softer print, partly filled with snow edges less sharp but still recognizable. This isn't his, Earl muttered. Smaller, lighter. Not a coyote either, unless a coyote's walking straight like a soldier. I'd say a female between full-grown and young, walking with him at least for now. The thought of another wolf, possibly a mate whose stride once matched the lonely males in these woods, made the air feel more tense, as if the hollow wasn't just landscape, but a room that once held a family now gone, with echoes lingering in scuffed snow and fur. What happened to her? Michael asked, voice rough but trying to sound neutral. That's what we're here to find out, Earl replied, steady and uncertain. Tracks go on. They did, the larger prints moving away from the hollow in a slightly less straight line, as if the animal had begun to grow more urgent. The terrain sloped sharply downward, trees opening into brief clearings where snow lay smooth, broken only by faint trails of smaller animals and dark scars from fallen limbs. As they descended, the air chilled again, a faint breeze moving through the trees ahead. Soon, the sound of water reached them, a muted whisper growing clearer until they reached a narrow ravine with a small creek under a cracked ice cover, dark patches reflecting the sky. The wolf's tracks led to the creek's edge, running alongside before ending in a disturbed snow patch with scattered prints and wider marks. Michael's stomach clenched before he fully understood. Something in the snow and disturbance triggered deep wordless memories. There, in the open, lay a wolf's body on its side, fur dull and matted from death, showing mottled gray, cream, and darker streaks. Snow clung unevenly to its flank, ice crusted near the ground. Its head was unnaturally tilted, eyes half-lidded and cloudy. Blood darkened the fur near the ribsage, with punctures recognizable as buckshot. Everything else faded, only his racing ears and the dead animal's stillness remained. No threat, no mystery, just a body lying cold by a frozen creek, close to where neighbors lived and talked of danger. Oh, he whispered, feeling a profound collapse inside. Earl moved slowly, his face tightening as he surveyed the scene, his gaze shifting from the wolf's wounds to the tracks around it. The wolf's own, pacing, circling, approaching and retreating repeatedly over the snow marked by the same paws. Somebody shot her, Earl said softly, from close. Not a clean kill, she bled out here. He found her afterward. Michael swallowed dryly, looking at the repeated dense tracks forming a nearly perfect circle. He imagined the male wolf stumbling upon the blood, smelling it before seeing the body, calling out one last time before silence. Then pacing, trying to grasp a loss that defied understanding. He keeps coming back, Michael said, pain clear in his voice. That's why he's howling up there. He doesn't understand why she doesn't answer, so he climbs to the highest spot he knows and calls for her. Or for what they had, Earl said softly, scanning the ground beyond the body, his expression shifting from sorrow to analysis as he considered the next problem. If there were pups, they'd be nearby, not far from her range. She wouldn't wander miles from them, especially now. She would have fed, returned, then fed again, if she doesn't come back. They starve, Michael said grimly, the word tasting like metal. Unless they're old enough and lucky to find food, which is unlikely, Earl added. But his behavior calling instead of moving on suggests something's wrong, unresolved. Either he doesn't know where they are, or he can't reach them. The image of small half-grown pups huddled alone in the cold, waiting for a mother who might never return, sank into Michael's mind, making his knees feel weak. He examined the dead wolf again, noting the slight muzzle narrowing and the female-shaped body, and felt a surge of anger that surprised him with its intensity at the shooter and the town's casual attitude towards solving problems without understanding the consequences. Do you think someone from town did this? He asked, his voice rough and unrefined. Hard to tell, Earl replied evenly. It might be one of ours who skipped the meeting to decide. Or an out-of-towner who saw an opening and took it thinking they were helping. Maybe a kid with too much firepower. Whoever it was, they didn't stick around after the shot. He took a slow breath, smoke swirling in front of his face, then looked at Michael with sharper, clearer eyes. What matters now isn't who did it, he said. What matters now is proof of his grief and a solid reason to believe a den with survivor pups might be between here and the ridge. If they're dead, he'll move on or go bad. If alive, he's calling to protect them from disappearance. Michael shifted his gaze from the dead she-wolf to the tracks leading from the clearing toward the ridge, sensing his world tipping. The conflict between removing the threat and honoring the fierce loyalty of that nightly call resolved into a decision he couldn't yet voice. He knew with clarity that later in the town hall he couldn't stand silent while Jim talked of a dangerous animal to be shot. He'd have his story, starting at this frozen creek with tracks around a body and the absence of smaller ones. As they turned away, the creek's murmur beneath the ice seemed like a silent refusal, indifferent to life or death. Each step through the snow felt heavier, his focus snagging on the small circle of tracks and the possibility of hidden pups, waiting for a mother who'd never return. Earl let him walk in quiet, his gaze fixed on the larger tracks climbing the slope, where frost-crushed paw prints darkened the surface. When Earl finally spoke, his voice steadier, laced with urgency, he said, he'd have had at least one more den, maybe 2 or 3. They sometimes moved pups to keep them safer from disease and scent buildup. If she was still caring for them when she was killed, they'd be near her accessible area. She wasn't wandering far, so we can find at least one site if we observe carefully. Michael listened, the words forming a mental map in his mind. He imagined the she-wolf moving through the trees in a pattern only visible from above den, creek, ridge. Den then realized they were now following parts of that same route from a different view, trying to piece together her life from snow tracks and her mate's behavior. How far would she range from them? He asked, sweeping a branch aside as they climbed a small hill, snow falling from needles onto his shoulder. In this country and season, not as far as you might think if the pups still relied on milk or her bringing food to the same spot, Earl replied. In early summer, she stayed close with shorter loops between den and hunting ground, but now they are older and more mobile, able to stagger or stay put as she ventured farther. Still, she kept within a rough circle she could cover in hours. The creek, ridge, and other landmarks are connected 2 points identified, but we need another. The snow thickened slightly as they moved from the creek, powder resting over firmer layers, muffling their steps into a soft, steady sound that seemed to sink into the trees. Occasionally, tufts of brown grass or ferns poked through, stiff with ice, and maple's bare branches lightly scratched their coats, leaving faint damp marks. The light had shifted, thickening the shadows between trunks more than just dusk, but a hint of evening, reminding that the day's brittle clarity wouldn't last. They didn't follow the wolf's tracks directly. Earl used them as guides while searching for other signs, small snow disturbances, indicating nearby activity. At one point, he diverted to examine indistinct marks under a fallen log, dismissing them as porcupine tracks, and elsewhere paused over faint indentations, which turned out to be bird pecks and hops in search of seeds. As they moved, Michael felt his frustration and impatience mounting, not because he wanted to end the search, but because each featureless snow patch and false lead reminded him of the pups he'd imagined tiny, bony figures curled tight in hidden hollows, their bodies burning through what their mother provided. Knowing that each hour they failed to find them shrank the fragile window between life and death. "We shouldn't have come with just the 2 of us," he said, exhaling roughly. "We should have brought half the town, made a grid, checked every hollow and stump. We're just wandering. They could be 100 yards away, and we'd never know." Earl paused and looked at him with a firm but not unkind gaze. "If we brought half the town," he said, "we'd have 100 sets of footprints trampling clues and people stepping into holes or arguing about the next move. It'd scare every living thing away. More bodies don't improve this. It's about slowing down and listening to what the land tells us." He paused briefly, allowing Michael to absorb not only the words but the underlying meaning, then his gaze softened slightly. "I'm not saying this isn't a long shot," he added. "It is. If they're alive, they're cold, hungry, and scared, facing tough odds. But our only chance is staying focused and not letting this." He tapped his temple lightly with a glove, "overwhelm what's real beneath our feet." The gentle reprimand brought Michael a flush of shame, yet also steadied his breath and shifted his focus outward. As they kept walking, he consciously loosened his gaze, observing not just the tracks, but the land's broader pattern, the slopes, rocks, stumps, and clusters of saplings hiding hollows. They climbed a low ridge where the trees looked battered as if storms had scarred them, and beyond, the ground flattened into a shelf before falling again, with wider spaced trees, as if something had once opened the canopy, allowing more light. The snow there was smooth, broken only by a few small tracks, likely rabbits or lighter animals, and near the edge, where the shelf met a steeper descent, a large spruce had fallen, its root ball protruding like a frozen fan, tangled with soil, rock, and roots forming a hollow. Earl slowed, his gaze sharp again. "That," he murmured, nodding toward the fallen tree, "is a sign a smart wolf remembers." The root mass formed a natural wall, its underside arching over a shallow cavity where earth had fallen away. Wind and weather had accumulated leaves and needles inside, while snow partly covered the opening without sealing it fully. From a distance, it appeared as just another small disturbance on the forest floor. Yet, as they approached carefully to avoid footprints, Michael detected a different scent, not just the typical cold earth smell, but something sharper, more personal, a faint musk of animal, urine, and old milk. It was subtle enough that he might have missed it days earlier, but now registered instinctively. "Smell that," Earl whispered, lowering himself as much as his joints allowed. leaning close to the shadowed entrance without risking his face in the opening. Michael crouched beside him, feeling the cold seep into his bones through his knees, and inhaled again. Beneath the crisp air, he sensed a layered aroma that suggested warmth despite the chill fur, fear, and the residue of days confined inside. Then he murmured the word more breath than speech. Earl nodded. Probably one of theirs. The question is if it's fresh or old, and whether someone's inside now. Earl placed a hand on Michael's arm briefly, steadying him. Whatever we do next, we proceed carefully, he said. If they're inside alive, we don't want to frighten them into fleeing or collapsing the structure. We also must avoid an injured adult lunging out, though if he were here now, signs of him would likely be visible. Michael nodded, his heartbeat quickening, and he realized that his fear was now sharper and more focused, no longer vague dread, but concern about finding only tiny frozen bodies. Earl moved to one side of the opening, positioning himself to reach in without blocking the light. He carefully removed a glove with his teeth, tucking it away. His pale thin hand, knuckles knotted from the cold, moved confidently as he cleared snow and debris from the hollow's edge to whiten the entrance. Stay to the side, he whispered to Michael. If something comes out suddenly, don't stand right in front. Keep the rifle pointed at the ground unless I say otherwise. We don't want any accidental triggers from a stray squirrel. Michael shifted, his boots slipping slightly on the snow, and braced himself, one hand on a tree and the other on the rifle sling to keep it in place. The forest seemed to hold its breath as Earl slowly reached into the hollow, tilting his head and listening closely. For a moment, only the faint rustling of leaves and fabric against roots was heard. Then, barely audible, a small thin whimper rose from within, a raw sound of something young and exhausted, pulled from its dreamless hunger. The noise hit him harder than a she-wolf's death, confirming that their story about the tracks and behavior was real, and that some part of the wild still survived. I've got one, Earl whispered tightly, carefully withdrawing his arm, holding a small gray pup, its fur dirty and flattened, belly sunken, legs limp but not dead, eyes barely open and crusted at the corners. It made another weaker sound and tried to snuggle against his skin for warmth. Michael's throat tightened. The pup was exactly what he imagined, yet more fragile, less a symbol of wildness, and more like any helpless infant, with ribs showing under thin flesh, oversized paws, and cracked paw pads from exposure and cold ground. Easy, little one, Earl murmured, his voice softer than Michael had ever heard before, like speaking to a fragile baby he was afraid to break. We've got you. He carefully moved the pup toward Michael. Take him, hide him under your coat. Body heat first, then food and water. Be prepared for more, this isn't over. As the pup touched his chest through the layers, Michael sensed its faint tremor and a tiny shiver, too small for such danger. An intense wave of protectiveness overwhelmed him. He tucked the animal against his chest, unzipping his coat to slide it inside his sweater. The pup's cold nose pressed briefly against his skin before it instinctively burrowed toward his warm hollow near his sternum. He barely settled it before another faint sound emerged from the den, joined by a slightly stronger, higher-pitched note. Earl reached in again, his hand disappearing up to the wrist and forearm, as he felt around the dark, tight space. He withdrew with two pups, one briefly by the scruff before he supported it, the other smaller and sluggish, its head lolling. Michael took one, tucking it inside his coat with the first, the tiny bodies pressed together, making his chest feel fuller than just his heart, while Earl placed the third under his own jacket, close to his chest, his breath catching as the cold weight settled. Outside the den, the trees, snow, and sky blurred into a flat backdrop, and only the three shivering lives pressed against them mattered. What they did next would decide whether the shivering stopped. For a few seconds, no one spoke. The pups made soft squeaks and weak protests, habitual sounds, and Michael felt a paw flex against his skin, tiny claws briefly catching on his sweater then slipping off, making his eyes sting. We can't leave them here, he finally said softly, with a desperation edge. Even if we try to bring him, he jerked his head vaguely toward the ridge, where the male wolf might be pacing down here. It's too exposed, too close to the creek, too easy to find. And without her, he couldn't finish. No, Earl agreed, tightening his jaw. We take them, warm them up, feed and hydrate them, and see if they can recover enough to return. Then we decide next steps. The rest Michael repeated, as the phrase raised many questions what the town would say. Jim's reaction if he knew about the pups in someone's house. How to return half-tame pups to a wary father without something going wrong. He looked at the bulge under his coat where the pups rested, sensing the heavy burden now on him, something he couldn't easily set down, not before neighbors or himself. "Let's go," Earl said with practical urgency but a softer tone. "Slow and steady, no falls. They can't risk twisting an ankle now after all they've been through." They left the den behind, climbing carefully toward the ridge, then down to the logging road and the waiting truck. Each step was deliberate, each breath a small clout in the cold, carrying the warmth of the pups and the weight of their decision, one that would linger long after the snow melted and the tracks around the dead she-wolf blurred into the white Vermont woods. When Michael and Earl returned to town with the heater maxed and the pups cozy in their coats, the gray November afternoon was quickly fading, light dwindling as if uninterested in continuation. The houses along Main Street looked solid yet slightly off, their windows glowing yellow against the blue sky, while bare trees stood like ink drawings against the horizon. The pups were a fragile weight against Michael's chest as he drove from Earl's place, where they had quickly grabbed a box, towels, and dented bowls. Despite the warmth of the truck, their trembling waves felt like a reminder, notes pressed directly against his heart that decisions once distant now pressed close. Their scent had begun to soak into his clothes, a mix of damp fur, sour milk, and a wild musk, unlike any domestic animal he knew, and he realized he couldn't walk into town hall without acknowledging the weight of his day. Earl sat beside him, zipped up high, a gloved hand over his chest where the third pup lay, his gaze fixed on the road with a thoughtful frown. Their silence was dense with unspoken words, and as Michael guided the truck into a parking spot near the town hall, they sat in quiet for a moment, listening to the cooling metal and muffled voices inside. "Are you sure about this?" Michael finally asked, knowing there were no clean options left. "Sure about what?" Earl replied, turning his head slightly to look at him. "Should we tell them what we found, bring the pups, or stand with Jim Dawson while claiming we took them? Which part did you mean?" "All of it," Michael replied, his joke falling flat. Earl's mouth turned into a faint smile that never fully appeared. "Here's what I'm sure of," he said. "If Jim stands there and describes a rabid monster on the ridge, without mentioning the dead female by the creek or the starving pups in the roots, we'll have done worse than shooting her ourselves." People decide differently when they know they're killing grief rather than a ghost. Michael recalled the she-wolf's body, the buckshot wounds, the snow where her mate circled, and clenched his fists inside his gloves. "Should we tell them about the pups? All of it?" he asked. Earl looked down at his chest, then back up with clearer eyes. "We tell the truth, what we saw and did. They'll find out soon enough. Secrets in a town this size die quickly. Better they hear it from us first than from gossip or a glance at a moving box." He opened the door, carefully swung his legs out, and kept his coat tight to keep the pup close. Michael followed, feeling the cold hit harder now that he was no longer protected by artificial warmth. The air was filled with exhaust, wood smoke, and the promise of snow. As they approached the hall along the short shoveled path, the pups shifted against their chests, making quiet sounds rare outside city noise, but piercing in Millhaven's late afternoon silence. Inside, the hall was nearly full, with the familiar folding chairs arranged loosely and Ed Hargrove at the battered lectern, hands resting on the edges for balance, though Michael knew he was steady. The temperature was warmer yet still drafty, and the scents coffee wet wool, old floorboards were now mixed with a sharper tension, visible in stiff backs, tense shoulders, and frequent glances at the door. Jim Dawson stood near the front, arms crossed, his orange cap pushed back, jaw clenched, seemingly prepared. Dave and Carol sat halfway up, coats on, Carol clutching a styrofoam cup, Dave drumming his fingers. Jess leaned against the back wall, arms folded, eyes alert, amid familiar faces people Michael had known, taught, passed by daily, sharing quiet nods that now seemed profound. When Michael and Earl entered, the murmurs lessened briefly, then resumed at the same volume, but with a different tone. Some looked at them, then looked away, others stared, lingering on their zip coats as if sensing something more. "Glad you made it," Hargrove said, voice raised to be heard clearly. "We were about to start, but it's better to hear from those who were there before we all judge." Jim's jaw clenched, but he stayed silent, which Michael saw as a rare feat. Earl moved beside the lectern, shoulders squared yet relaxed, appearing both lean and sturdy. Michael positioned himself slightly to the side and back, observing the crowd without feeling overly exposed. The pup against his chest stirred, and he pressed his hand gently on it, hoping to soothe both. Earl cleared his throat. "We went to the same ridge as last night," he said calmly, voice projecting naturally. "Same spot where he howls. We found his tracks on the crest, revealing a few things. He's alone, no pack signs. Also, he's been pacing the same area repeatedly, not just running through. Confirmed, a lone male called from a fixed point. Following his trail from the ridge led us to an older den and then to a creek where we found her." "Her who?" asked someone, though Michael guessed the man already knew. "His mate," Earl replied, "an adult female wolf, around 5 years old, dead with buckshot wounds, likely hit at close range. Based on the blood in the snow and the tracks layout, she died there, and he found her afterward. He spent time wandering around her body before returning to the ridge to call out what he lost." A murmur spread through the room, not quite sympathy or discomfort, but something in between. Michael noticed some faces soften around the eyes, others tightening, as Earl's story touched on something personal beyond abstract predator fears. Jim shifted his stance, jaw clenched. "That's all very sad," he said stiffly, "but it doesn't change that a male has been howling 3 nights in a row, and the townspeople can't sleep or let their kids out without thinking of a predator nearby. Wolves kill livestock, dogs, and anything vulnerable. You know that, Earl. Losing his mate may make him even less predictable." Earl nodded once, then shook his head. "It's more complex than you think," he said. "A grieving male with a partner and litter is different from a pack expanding territory. That doesn't make him harmless. He's not out for fun, he's trying to mend his world with his voice." "You said maybe a litter," Jess asked, straightening. "Does that mean what I think?" Earl looked at Michael, and in that moment, the secret of the puppies under their coats turned from private to unavoidable. "When we followed his pattern," Earl said slowly, "we found a smaller den under a fallen spruce near the female. Inside were 3 pups, cold, skin and bones, yet still breathing. We took them out and kept them warm in our coats, bringing them here." The room fell silent, with even tiny sounds noticeable: snow melting from a hat, a chair creaking. Carol covered her mouth, wide-eyed. Dave's eyebrows lifted, his fingers pausing on his knee. Jim's face turned darker red under his cap. "You brought wolf pups into town," he shouted, outrage clear. "You took them from the woods, away from their father, and carried them like kittens. Are you crazy?" Michael's face flushed with anger and shame, not because he thought they'd done wrong, but because hearing Jim say it bluntly made him realize how it sounded stripped of the den's smell, and the trembling pups making their choice feel like an obligation. "They were dying," he said suddenly, surprised at how quickly his voice cut Jim off. "You weren't there, Jim. You didn't see their ribs showing or how cold they were. Their mother was dead by the creek, shot in the side. Their father was exhausting himself pacing the ridge, calling for something unreachable. If we'd left, the pups would have frozen or starved inside a hole while we discussed the town's wolf threat." "They're wild animals," Jim responded. "They're not your students. You can't rescue them just because nature does what it does. Now you have 3 semi-tame predators that will recognize people, associating houses with food and warmth. Do you think that makes them safer when they're grown? The logic stung not entirely because Jim was right, but because he wasn't completely wrong. The ethical dilemma had been lingering in Michael's mind since they rescued the pups, now tangled with the realities of living near chickens, goats, and children at play. We didn't take them as pets, Michael said, keeping his voice steady. We removed them because they were dying, and we were there. If you'd seen them, you'd have made the same choice whether you admit it or not. Now we must decide what happens next, with the whole town involved, but pretending the moment in the woods where inaction was violent isn't honest. Jess moved away from the wall, boots scuffing on the boards. I want to see them, she said, firm, not because I think they're adorable, but because if we're discussing killing their father or saving them, I want faces with the talk. Absolutely not, Jim cut in. Opening those coats here will soften everyone. Kids will want to bottle feed them, and people will forget they grow up to hunt deer or other prey. They already hunt deer, Earl said sharply, turning some heads. That's what wolves do. If we're fortunate enough to have a few again after a century of extermination, we shouldn't be shocked by their behavior. The real question isn't their danger in theory, but whether we'll respond with violence or seek a more nuanced solution. A voice from the back, Harold Mason, the landowner bordering the wolf's territory, murmured complicated answers. Get people hurt. I have grandkids nearby. I don't want some predator hanging around just because it thinks there are freebies in town. That image, the lone male wolf, drawn by scent or instinct, edging closer to Millhaven in search of pups hidden under human clothing, pierced Michael deeply, provoking a sharp pang of guilt. He envisioned the wolf's silhouette on the ridge, freezing as it sensed them, memorizing their presence, then prowling through the snow towards someone's yard, nose full of milk, sweat, and detergent scents. We don't keep wolves here, Michael said quickly, words spilling out as if he was trying to outrun worst-case scenarios. We only need to get them through the next 48 hours, keep them warm, hydrated, and fed so we can assess their chances. Afterwards, we need a place to hold them that doesn't turn into a backyard problem, like a rescue or wildlife rehab that minimizes human contact. Perhaps an area near Earl's, away from town, could work. We must find options between doing nothing and shooting anything frightened. Jim replied, you don't know if their father will accept them. You scent warm and feed them, then hope he doesn't attack out of confusion after you move the half-domesticated wolves into the woods. Michael hesitated as the question touched on his deepest fears he wasn't ready to face. He remembered the pups pressing their noses against him, searching for warmth and milk, and the idea of returning them to that tense tall figure on the ridge, trusting, an animal likely wary of human scent. We don't know, he finally said softly. We can't predict how he'll react or find the right balance between saving them now and avoiding worse outcomes later. But we do know that if we do nothing, they'll die. And if we send a hunting party tomorrow with everyone cheering, we won't just stop a howl, we'd be undoing something already begun near that creek. The room's mood shifted, not toward agreement, but toward deeper discomfort. The tidy story many had wanted animal approaches, town defends itself, problem resolved was broken, revealing a mess of incomplete actions and unintended effects. Faces once resolute now looked troubled, while others, wary, shared a strained compassion that had prompted Michael to get into Earl's truck the night before. Hargrove, listening with his head bowed and hands on the lectern, finally straightened. Tonight, we're not making a lifetime plan for Vermont wolves, he said, voice weary but firm. We decide what happens in Millhaven over the next 2 days. I propose we give Michael and Earl time to help the pups away from town. During that time, they call and find any official organization to keep these animals wild long term. No one shoots the male during these 2 days. We let him howl or stay silent without more gunfire. After 48 hours, we meet again, hear their findings, assess the pups, and make a decision with more info and less panic. Jim clenched his jaw. Michael could see the muscle twitch. You're asking us to accept that sound for 2 more nights, he said. You're asking us to let a dangerous predator roam outside while we wait on a Burlington rehab. I'm urging us not to choose the loudest, easiest option due to fear, Hargrove replied. Fear is natural and keeps us alive, but doesn't always reveal what's beyond. 2 days isn't forever, it's an opportunity we owe ourselves, if not the animals. A long silence followed, as if everyone was considering the implications. Michael sensed the puppy breathing under his coat, each quiet rise and fall symbolizing their plan, while observing his neighbor's fleeting expressions, lips twitching, eyes narrowing, brows softening. Dave finally cleared his throat loudly, breaking the silence. I don't like it, he said softly. Wolves near my home bother me, and I dread my boy asking about that noise tonight with no good answer. But I also refuse to turn this town into one that settles issues with guns quickly. 2 days feels like a reasonable compromise. Carol, standing beside him, nodded, her eyes bright. If those pups are alive because they went up there, she said, glancing at Michael and Earl, then I can handle the howling a few more nights, even if I think it's just a monster among the trees. Others voiced their opinions, some reluctantly, others more open, and although not everyone spoke, Michael felt the shift, leaning toward reluctant acceptance rather than enthusiasm. Jim looked as if he were grinding his teeth, but when Hargrove finally asked, "Can we live with that?" The hunter gave a slight nod, a downward tilt of his head that felt more truce than agreement. 48 hours, he said. If we're no closer to a solution by then, I'll stop waiting. Michael met his gaze, feeling the weight of the limited time both insufficient and unexpectedly long, and realized he would have to become someone he hadn't planned. Someone who could balance his town's fear and the animal's life honestly. That morning, when he entered his kitchen with the pups, the room, usually plain and functional, seemed inadequate, as if it belonged to a different life where small details didn't matter. The three tiny figures in the cardboard box made the space feel more like a makeshift clinic than a home where a middle-aged teacher sipped coffee and graded papers. After the meeting, they had agreed his house was better suited than Earl's for the first critical hours, more insulated, with less risk of frozen pipes, and more reliable water. Earl had insisted on placing the box in the mudroom, away from main areas, but Michael nodded, knowing the line between the pups and his life would be thin. Now, kneeling on the cold linoleum with damp knees from melted snow, he watched one weak puppy shift among towels, while the others lay almost unnaturally still, their uneven, shallow breaths loud in the quiet. The house's warmth was starting to help. Their stiff, cold fur was softening, one curling into a tight comma instead of being limp. Yet, their dull, gummy eyes and twitching paws betrayed weakness. Hunger had stripped them down to bones, and dehydration made their skin thin and papery, making Michael fear his own hands. He had never fed animals this small before. He once bottle fed a neighbor's lamb as a teen when a ewe died suddenly, and the lamb was energetic and strong, reassuring him. These pups were different. Each move seemed like a struggle they had to force themselves into making. He was anxious about doing too much or too little, moving fast or slow as he heated water and mixed it with condensed milk and broth, until they could get specialized formula from the feed store. Earl was more confident, though still cautious, his large hands gentle, as if handling delicate glass, not fur and bones. He boiled water, tested it on his wrist, and placed 3 small bottles on the counter, their makeshift nipples cut from rubber gloves, reminding Michael of war stories where field hospitals improvised using whatever was available. We warm them before giving fluids, Earl said, softly, eyes on the pups. Cold stomachs can't handle much. Cold guts can shut down. We layer it, warmth, sips, rest, then more. They've been on fumes long enough, they don't trust abundance yet. Michael nodded, unsure if it was for Earl or himself. He reached into the box and gently lifted the strongest pup, noticing its surprising weight for its size, bones, muscles, and organs more substantial than it looked. The coarse fur felt strange, but not unpleasant as he cradled the pup, wrapping it in a towel. It trembled slightly, as if feeling the switch from damp chill to dry warmth. "It's all right," he murmured automatically, though the pup had no understanding of words. "You're safe. You're here." He leaned against the cabinet, the pup against his chest, while Earl lifted another and did the same, two rough-coated figures on the scuffed kitchen floor, rocking slightly without noticing. The third pup remained in the box, wrapped in towels, a hot water bottle beside it, its breathing so shallow that Michael checked repeatedly to ensure it hadn't faded. Outside, November morning light spread across the snow, illuminating the frost on the window. The distant sounds of town, waking a plow, a truck door, a dog barking, felt out of sync, as if they existed in a different bubble where time stretched and shrank, based on whether a pup swallowed or choked. When they finally gave him the first bottle, it was nothing like the smooth latch of a human infant Michael had seen during rare, quiet hospital visits. The pup's mouth opened, then weakly closed around the rubber, its tongue sluggish. After a moment, it managed a few awkward sucks, throat muscles working hard, tiny amounts of liquid vanishing like a miracle. Michael held the bottle with one hand and the pup with the other, his fingers cramping, afraid to shift grip and break something vital. "Easy," Earl said, watching critically as he fed his own pup nearby. "Don't flood him. Let him find his rhythm. Don't squeeze too hard, you'll drown him. They need success, not speed." The word success felt almost unbearably tender. They discussed ounces and swallowing mechanics, but the stakes made exam language seem oddly fitting. He observed the pup's throat move, muscles working, and realized he had never been so aware of someone else's physical process, not even beside his father's hospital bed years ago, listening to the wheeze and rattle of a damaged lung. This, too, involved respiratory, cardiovascular, and digestive functions, but felt closer, more immediate, because his hands were part of the process. They took turns feeding the pups, pausing when they grew tired, letting them rest against their chest until their hearts slowed and breaths steadied. Returning the pups to the box, the towel nest felt less like a shroud and more like a cradle. Color returned to their ears, gums pinked, and one, seeming near death, managed to wobble on shaky legs before collapsing again, limbs tangled but not entirely hopeless. Exhaustion weighed on Michael not only from the night in the woods and the emotional toll of the town meeting, but from hours of focused care, every nerve strained to keep these tiny bodies alive. His back ached, eyes burned from the heat and strain of tiny details. A dull headache pressed at his skull's edge. Still, each time he closed his eyes, he saw the den, the dead female by the creek, the lone male on the ridge. The knowledge that no one else in Millhaven could bear this burden kept him rooted. Eventually, Earl stood, joints cracking, stretching slowly. "I should make some calls," he said. "I have numbers from my Fish and Wildlife Days people, who might still answer, or know if there's a rehab in the state that handles rabies animals without euthanasia. I'm not promising miracles, but it beats guessing." Michael nodded, absent-mindedly stroking the pup on his lap. "Use the living room phone," he said. "Less drafty. I'll keep trying here." Earl's hand briefly touched his shoulder, grounding him. When Earl left, the house felt emptier and more vulnerable, as if the walls had thinned. Michael listened to Earl's muffled voice in the next room, navigating answering machines, office transfers, and civil servants unprepared for a call about wolf pups rescued from illegal shooting in a small town. The calls didn't yield quick solutions. One agency directed them elsewhere, then to voicemail, promising a callback as soon as possible, which, given government delays, could mean anything from hours to a week. A southern nonprofit explained they only handled small mammals without rabies risk, and predators like pups fell under different regulations. An old colleague of Earl's, now retired in New Hampshire, offered sympathy and basic tips for minimizing human contact while caring, but gave little practical help. When Earl returned to the kitchen, his face showed the weight of those talks. Best option so far is a rehabber in Roxbury who sometimes accepts coyotes, he said, lowering himself with a grunt. "He's licensed for that, but he's often full, especially in winter." I left a message. If he calls back today, that'll be lucky. For now, we keep them alive and as unimprinted as possible, which is tricky since we have the bottles. Michael found the idea of minimizing human contact while holding the pups against his chest grimly ironic, but understood the point. More human time, scent, and voice pushed pups away from wildness toward a state neither dog nor wolf, hard to categorize. I can keep them mostly in the mudroom, he said slowly, considering. In the box with towels and hot water bottles. We feed them quietly, avoiding unnecessary handling or affection. They will hear us, but may not link us to comfort beyond food and warmth. He noticed his own words, sensing unease as he slipped into jargon business-like associate us with comfort, as if distancing language could protect his emotions. Yet, when he looked at the puppy in his hands, its small jaw working in sleep, a thin milk line on its chin, he knew any emotional detachment was fragile. The day repeated feed, clean, warm, rest, and each time the pups became slightly more responsive, relearning trust after days of deprivation. Outside, the wind rattled bare branches, swirling snow, and the sky lowered into a gray clouded ceiling that muted the afternoon light. Once, Michael stepped onto the back stoop to throw towels into the washer, feeling the heaviness that signaled more snow approaching, likely to pile up overnight and reshape the town. By evening, a dull ache settled in his back and shoulders, his eyes gritty as if sanded, but he hesitated to lie down, unwilling to be more than one room from the small cardboard world on his kitchen floor. It was irrational. Earl was there. The pups were more stable now than at dawn, reducing the risk of escape. Still, waking from even a brief nap to find the box silent, terrified and more than gentle fatigue. As evening arrived, the town's routines continued beyond his walls, diner filling for dinner, lights turning on in Dave and Carol's house, middle schoolers grousing about homework, children bouncing off furniture, while parents try to manage them. Somewhere, residents listened for the familiar midnight sound, preparing for another restless night as he held part of the reason for that sound within reach, making his stomach tighten. When night fell suddenly, with clouds blocking the last light, the outside world became a black mirror. The overhead lamp cast a faint yellow glow over the sink and box, shadows swallowing the house. Earl stretched his back and looked at the stove clock. I should go home for a few hours, he said. Feed myself anything but coffee and worry. Rest while I can. I'll be back before dawn. If that rehabber calls after I leave, note all he says as gospel, then we'll evaluate what's useful in the morning. Should I really stay here alone with them tonight? Michael asked, not doubting his ability to feed and warm them, but feeling the weight of the male wolf howling on the ridge and the puppies on the kitchen floor. You won't be alone, Earl replied with slight humor. You'll have 3 hungry mouths and more responsibility than most see in a month. The town trusts you more than me, whether they realize it or not. You're their teacher. Kids in front of you daily. If it goes wrong, they'll question me. If right, they'll remember you kept the pups alive. It's unfair, but that's how people work. Michael's chest felt tight, not from fatigue, but from the thought that someone might remember him as nothing more than the man assigning too many essays. What if he comes closer? He finally asked, the question bothering him all afternoon. What if he hears or smells them and leaves the ridge tonight? Earl's gaze momentarily drifted as if visualizing, then he focused again. If he comes closer, he'll circle the town or your property edge, but won't knock on your door like a dog, he replied. He's wild, wary, and just had his worst week. Grief doesn't make predators forget human scent, but alters their nights. Keep lights low, pups quiet, and avoid outside sounds you don't understand. Doors and walls should do their jobs. When Earl left, the house fell into a quieter, more domestic silence. Fridge hum, heater rasp, and clock ticking. The pups slept, a bit rounder but still thin. Michael sat at the table, clutching a lukewarm mug of tea, lost in thought. His mind replayed the town meeting Jim's outrage, Carol's cautious compassion, Hargrove's pragmatism layered with the memory of the wolf's silhouette on the ridge, standing firm in its voice. As midnight neared, a strange tension filled the house, as if even the furniture waited. Michael moved quietly, checked locks twice, and looked out the window at the dark yard. Snow soft and blurred, trees dark against the night. Each turn away felt like an unseen hand pulling at his back. At 11:30, he fed the pups again. They were stronger, swallowing more confidently. When returned to their box, they curled into a loose knot, heat pooling like a coal in a small space. He placed a hot water bottle under towels, tucked in the edges, and sat on the floor beside the box, leaning against the cabinet, eyes half closed. He didn't plan to sleep, but fatigue took over. His head dipped several times, and he drifted into a state between wakefulness and dreams where sounds blurred. He heard the heater sigh, the clock tick, the pups make soft noises, and beneath those, a long, low sound rose and stretched, filling his mind like a vivid memory and vibrating through his chest. His eyes snapped open. The howl sounded again, clearer through walls and glass, closer than previous nights, not directly outside, but not as distant as the ridge. It seemed to rise from beyond the trees at the back of his property, perhaps still up the slope, but nearer, threading between trunks over snow, carrying grief and a rough and almost hoarse edge. The pups stirred, one lifted its head, ears flicked, and a whimper escaped, perhaps instinctive or something else. Michael's heart pounded loudly, his instincts screaming to turn off the light, hide, and retreat to the house's center, where walls shielded him from the night. He sat still, his back against the cabinet, eyes on the dark window, listening. The howl rose and fell, not in dominance but in a searching rhythm, like on the ridge a call into an unanswered world. Yet now he sensed a connection between that voice, the box beside him, and the tiny breaths and heartbeats that had briefly become his anchor. The sound remained eerie, raising hairs on his arms, but slightly less distant, no longer just the wolf on the ridge, but a father's voice for pups in a human kitchen, slowly learning to live. Michael sat, shallow breathing, until the last note faded and night closed in. The pups settled, faint whimpers fading into sleep. Somewhere beyond his yard, an animal already lost watched for a response that never came. The silence filled by the gentle dreaming of pups, but Michael's chest still felt tight. When the next morning's gray light revealed the trees beyond the window, it seemed as if the night had run him over and backed up. As he stretched, the box of pups pulled his attention away, their breathing less fragile, more rhythmic, something a body could endure. He slept in fragments, brief disjointed spells where his head tipped back, images flickered, the ridge, the female by the creek, the male's silhouette. The town hall's rows of chairs, only to awaken at each soft paw scratch or weak whimper from the box, reaching instinctively for towels. Each time he checked, their bodies grew slightly warmer, their bellies less hollow, and though one still lay limp, a slow small rise at its flank persisted. Outside, worn pewter clouds promised little snow, and a thin dusting blurred yesterday's footprints. The town was rousing. He heard a distant truck on Route 9 and the faint clang of metal at the gas station where someone was likely positioning a plow. Beyond the houses and trees, the ridge was invisible but looming. Knowing the male wolf had come closer overnight weighed on Michael like an undecided stone in his chest. Earl arrived after sunrise, his muted 3-beat knock that Michael recognized instinctively. When he opened the door, the older man stepped in with cold air, snow dusting his coat, cheeks raw from the wind, eyes combining worry and practicality, as if he'd spent hours selecting the right tools for the task. "How'd they do?" he asked before removing his boots, his gaze already drifting toward the box on the floor. "They're still here," Michael replied, feeling both a literal understatement and that it was the most vital fact each time they took more. "The little one scared me once at age 3. He froze, but came back after I warmed him and tried a few drops on his gums. Not sure if that's right or superstition, but doing nothing felt wrong. Sometimes action is all that keeps a body from darkness," Earl said softly. He took off his coat, hung it up, and knelt by the box, movements careful and steady. They looked better than expected, or at least not worse, which is a win considering their condition. He lifted each pup, gently checking ribs, hydration, gums, and eyes, applying his experience across species with efficient tenderness. When he lifted the smallest, it protested with more energy than anything from yesterday, its thin sound oddly defiant, as if a feral core had reemerged. That one's got some fight, after all, Earl murmured, the corner of his mouth twitching. That's good. Sometimes you need anger to survive. Hunger alone isn't enough. They resumed their rhythm, more precise than the day before, with hands executing familiar motions while their minds wrestled with bigger questions. Bottles warmed, pups fed carefully, towels changed, and hot water bottles refilled. During a break, Michael updated Earl on the night's events, the closer howl, sounding as if it came from beyond the tree line rather than the ridge, the pup's restless movement, and how the sound seemed to thread through the house walls, linking to the box like an invisible thread. He's off the crest, at least for now, Earl said, slightly frowning. He might be tracing his own tracks between the den, creek, ridge, and other spots, trying to reassemble the pattern. If he gets close enough to smell them human house, wolf pups, his scent from days ago, it will confuse him. That kind of scent trail either makes a wolf run or break. The image of the male wolf at the yard's edge, sniffing the mingled scents of humans and pups, torn between instinct and confusion, weighed heavily on Michael's imagination. He recalled the village's limited patience, Jim's clenched jaw, and Harold's muttered mention of grandkids, realizing how fragile the line between rescue and disaster had become. They took turns calling, chasing details like snow tracks, until mid-morning when external help appeared. Earl set down the phone, his sigh complex neither relief nor disappointment. Howling Mountain, he said, rubbing his forehead, in Starksboro. A rehab run by a woman on several hundred acres. She handles rabies-carrying animals like coyotes and foxes. Not thrilled about wolves due to extra paperwork and scrutiny, but she didn't hang up when I mentioned them. She's full, of course. They always are, but she said if we get them there today, she'll check for space. No promises. The name Howling Mountain struck Michael with irony, yet its existence in their state, where wild orphan carnivores are seen as beings to help and release, changed something. It didn't solve everything town fears, the wolf's grief, ethics of moving pups from forest to facility remained. Still, possibilities expanded. Today, Michael repeated, wiping his face. That's a couple of hours each way if roads are good, more if the snow intensifies. We go, leave them, then what? We return and tell the town we passed their problem to a woman in the hills, hoping that's enough. We go there, get a professional's opinion, Earl said. Someone who understands what it costs to keep wild animals in captivity and how hard it is to reintroduce them into a world that doesn't want them. We ask her about the father, about chances for a safe reunion, not ending in blood. We gather info before returning to that hall, letting tired, scared people decide what's next. That's a roll. Michael thought of leaving the pups and driving away, feeling his throat tighten. But when he saw one nose against the box, testing the cardboard as if thinking beyond, he understood his kitchen was only a temporary stop, not a solution. They could keep the pups alive a few days, but not keep them wild or safe from the town's shifting moods. Then we go, he said, feeling the weight of the decision. Pack them, drive slow, hope the weather holds, and that the truck doesn't give out today. We see what she says. Preparing didn't take long. The mudroom nest became their transport, lined with thicker towels, and hot water bottles replaced with newer, hotter ones wrapped in cloth to prevent burns. Michael tucked an extra towel around them, leaving just enough space for air, but not enough to toss if the road got rough. He murmured small reassurances, like soothing an infant, which eased his nerves even if the pups didn't understand. Outside, the sky lowered with heavy unfallen snow, and light flurries drifted lazily, testing the ground. The truck's engine coughed and caught, feeling more fragile than usual given the precious cargo inside. They decided the box would stay on Michael's lap, kept safe by his body and hands while Earl drove. Earl knew the back roads, well-iced corners, deeper drifts, frozen culverts where to be cautious. As they left the driveway, passing Millhaven, Michael's attention sharpened, noticing small scenes, the flickering neon sign of the diner, the open light shining, though breakfast all day flickered. The act of leaving with 3 small wild lives heightened his focus on the ordinary world they were leaving behind. A child in a thin jacket kicked snow on the curb, his breath visible, briefly looking toward the truck's sound before returning to his game. A woman from the library carried trash to the dumpster, shoulders hunched against the cold, eyes on the ground. Nobody on the street knew what was inside the old truck's cab. No one realized 3 small hearts beat close to Michael's hands. The thought made him feel both powerful and guilty, as if holding a secret that could change everything depending on how it unfolded. The route out of town wound through hills and forests, snow thickening as they climbed, the tires hissing softly on slush. Earl drove carefully, his hands steady, eyes scanning for deer, branches, or hazards that could cause trouble. The heater emitted warm, dry air smelling faintly of antifreeze and dust, and the pups shifted inside, little blind movements reacting to engine vibrations. As the miles passed, Michael's mind, free from immediate worries, wandered to places he kept at bay. He thought of Mexican wolf pups being reintroduced into wild dens in the West, stories of conservation efforts where humans slip young wolves into nests while mothers hunt, then leave quickly, allowing adult wolves to find larger litters, their instincts overriding suspicion. The contrast between sanctioned interventions and their rough rescue in Vermont was stark, yet both aimed to repair nature's torn fabric, restoring what was lost, preventing a cut from ending. The issue was that fostering these pups back into their father's life would happen near a small, vulnerable community already haunted by one wolf's voice. He envisioned weeks later, if the pups survived, a twilight scene, a basket left on the ground, shadows lurking as a wary animal approached, sniffed, and decided whether to accept or reject the return. Though cinematic, he reminded himself animals do not follow human stories, grief doesn't always bring gratitude, and fear doesn't always turn to recognition. The road climbed and dipped, snow thickening on branches and shoulders. Passing through settlements and stretches of trees with frosted mailbox signs, Michael felt both closer to a solution and further from comfort, as if each mile peeled away layers of security. Turning onto the narrow snow-covered drive to Howling Mountain revealed a landscape of enclosures and dark pines, fences topped with overhangs to deter climbers. Inside some pens, he glimpsed movement, a fox's flash of red, a large raccoon, or a quick, unidentifiable creature. The air here had a distinct smell, mingling animal scents, hay, disinfectant, and evergreen wildness contained but not tamed. A woman in a heavy coat and knit cap stepped out of a building, wiping her hands on a towel and squinting at the bright snow. In her late 40s or early 50s, with weathered skin and a sharp gaze, she assessed the truck and the box on Michael's lap quickly. "You're the ones with wolf pups," she said without preamble. "I'm Medora. Let's get them inside before we explain choices we can't undo." Her voice was brisk, unemotional, but not judgmental, emphasizing care before conversation. Inside, the air was warmer, animal scent sharper but not overwhelming, with stainless steel tables and shelves holding supplies that seemed both familiar and strange: bottles, syringes, fluids, towels, blankets, metal bowls, and laminated charts. Michael gently placed the box on a table as if it contained explosives. Medora quickly put on gloves, then peeled back the towel, reaching in with practiced speed and delicacy, reminiscent of Earl, but honed by many seasons' experience. She examined all 3 pups, swiftly lifting, turning, checking eyes, gums, belly, and hydration each in seconds, her brow furrowed with each detail. "They're in bad shape," she finally said, indicating serious concern, "but they're not beyond help. You arrived just in time or close enough. How long since they left the dam?" "At least a couple of days," Earl replied. "We found the female dead by a creek shot. Blood and tracks suggest she'd been there a while. The male had been pacing nearby. They were icy when we removed them from the den. She nodded as if considering several scenarios. Mother shot, father on a ridge, pups starving underground, she said. I wish I could say it's rare, but it's not. The wolf's uncommon here, the rest is usual. She grabbed a bag of fluids and a needle, preparing a line with quick, precise motions. We'll start with warmed fluids under the skin, she explained. Then proper formula, not some kitchen fix, no offense. You did what you could. I'll keep them quietly separated out back, away from the others. Minimal contact as best as I can. You can return to check, but not too often. If they survive the next 3 days, we can consider the week beyond. Until then, they're just inches from the shadow line. Michael watched the needle slide into the smallest pup's scruff, forming a warm hump of fluid, feeling both relief and helplessness. His usefulness shrank here, his hands, vital in the den and kitchen, now hovered uncertainly at his sides. Medora and her setup, charts, and supplies had taken over the practical work of keeping the pups alive, leaving him as a witness, storyteller, or messenger between worlds. What about their father? He asked, unable to suppress his question any longer. He's alone out there, howling every night at midnight from the ridge. Last night, he came closer. The town demands he be gone, giving us 48 hours to stop hunters from going up the hill. Could there be a way? For him to get them back, for them to return to him instead of being behind fences. Medora paused, holding her line, and looked at him steadily, as if evaluating both the question and the man. In theory, she replied. Yes, stories from the Southwest and the Mexican wolf program show pups taken from dens are often reaccepted by wild mothers. Wolves' innate care instincts are strong when the timing is right. Currently, with an adult male whose mate was shot, pups handled by humans, and territory bordering a town with people who see him as a monster, the chances are slim. Not impossible, but thin. She secured the line, taped it, and moved to the next pup, her hands steady even while speaking. If they stay and survive, they'll grow up near people with minimal handling, she said. They'll learn to fear us if I do my job right. When they're old enough, if allowed, I'll release them where there's space and prey, fewer roads. Not here, not outside your town. I don't release animals near gunfire unless authorized by higher authorities. Her clear response had two effects. Michael felt some relief at the pups surviving somewhere, adapting to wolves rather than being strange liminal creatures, yet another part of him mourned the fragile narrative he had created. A story of a family potentially healing after one gunshot through human choices. And the male, Earl, asked, what happens to him while they're here learning to live without him? Medora's lips pressed into a thin line. He keeps howling, she said, until he stops. He tries new patterns or doesn't. He adjusts his range or paces the painful spots. Maybe someone shoots him or he moves into the hills to avoid fire. Maybe he finds another mate or not. His story's his alone. I can't fix everything. I can only save 3 small pieces today. That bluntness felt like a slap, but also a necessary jolt. Michael realized, surprisingly tired, that he viewed the entire situation as one problem with a single solution, satisfying both human and wolf. Medora, at a rehab center with a pup, reminded him that the world rarely offers such symmetry. Saving pups doesn't redeem the town, shooter or male. It's just one act amid much damage. A twist of grief and acceptance clenched his chest. Will you call us? He asked, his voice rough. Let us know if they survive. I'll call if they die, she said, then softened upon his flinch. And if they survive the hard part, I'll call then too. I can't give every rescuer updates, but you went out of your way. I can spare a call. For now, go home. You've done enough. The town waits to decide if it howls back or reaches for the gun closet. The empty box, smelling of damp towels and milk, felt surprisingly light as they carried it to the truck. Outside, the sky lowered further, snow thickening into a steady fall that blurred trees and enclosures. As they drove away, the rehab center disappeared behind the forest, its low buildings and fenced fields quickly swallowed, and Michael felt the distance grow, not just in miles, but in stories. One of 3 pups under heat lamps, cared for by a woman dedicated to fragile lives, another of a lone male pacing above Millhaven, his voice tearing through the cold, and a third of a town debating under fluorescent lights whether it could live with the echoes of its choices. He rested his hands on his knees and watched the road slip beneath the truck, the snow-slick asphalt a moving ribbon that linked their stories, though he knew it wouldn't last forever. The snow had thickened into a steady fall as they neared Millhaven's familiar landmarks, softened barns and houses, with fresh roofs making everything appear cleaner, as if reset during their absence. Yet Michael felt no lightness from the first snow, as the empty cardboard box at his feet seemed to hum with what it no longer held, pressing just below his ribs. Rolling down Main Street, the town's small details flickering TVs, a kid with a sled, smoke from Hargrove's chimney appeared unchanged. But Michael viewed them differently now, overlaying the scene with awareness of the unseen links to the wild ridge and Medora's sterile enclosures. The thought of 3 pups under heat lamps 2 towns away connected by fluids and formula instead of cold air didn't relieve him. It only created another concern, another place his mind traveled when he heard the wolf's howl at night. Earl parked outside Michael's house long enough for him to unload the box into the mudroom, where it looked even more hollow than in the truck. Earl then drove away without turning off the engine, jaw clenched. "You coming?" he asked. "Where?" Michael replied, already suspecting the answer. "Up toward the ridge," Earl said. "Not all the way, not in bad weather, but close enough to see his intentions with daylight. We have a few hours before the town hall fills again with strangers ready to pronounce on unseen issues. I want a fresh perspective when I listen. I need to know if he's still pacing the same spot or if snow and silence have started to change him." The thought of turning back toward the woods so soon, while Medora's warmth still clung to his clothes, made Michael's body protest. Yet, the image of Jim Dawson at the front of the hall, with the story beginning and ending with lone, dangerous predator, tightened something in his chest. If fresh tracks and new patterns could add depth to his speech tonight, he couldn't justify staying home and letting fatigue decide. "I'm coming," he said, closing his door harder than necessary, as if the sound could reinforce his resolve. The road to the logging turnout was slicker than 2 days before, with new snow-hiding ice patches, and Earl drove patiently, which made Michael more nervous each slow turn, adding time for his mind to race ahead to the hall and faces he'd see soon. The sky hung low, a dull gray, obscuring where clouds ended and ridges began, with trees flanking the road, thin caps of white on their branches, dark trunks with snow on the windward side, as if painted hurriedly. At the turnout, they left the truck partly off the road, wheels chalked by hastily piled snow and gravel, and stepped into air colder than expected for early afternoon, the kind that sank under coats and between layers, as if it had its own will. The profound silence was broken only by faint snow hiss and occasional tree creaks. Their breath-formed clouds blending with falling flakes, while the snow squeaked softly underfoot, just enough to show their passage. They retraced their familiar night path, but soon the fresh snow erased past marks, shifting focus to the wolf's tracks laid down since the last snowfall. Earl narrowed his eyes, scanning the ground for a clear, confident print line that once cut through the scattered remains of deer and rabbits. There he sat after a few silent moments, gesturing to depressions along a low ridge, their spacing and depth unmistakable. Fresh, less than a few hours old, or the edges would be softer in this snow. The tracks followed the ridge trail's outline, but with slight deviations, pauses, backtracks, then forward movements suggesting the wolf's uncertainty. Michael crouched near a print, observing the clarity of the toe pads, the slight spread indicating weight and motion, and felt an odd, almost tangible echo in his chest, as if some part of him had been holding his breath and now exhaled. "He's lighter," Earl said, catching him off guard. Notice the depth compared to previous ones. Either the snow is denser or he's burning more energy. Likely the latter less food, more pacing, fewer sleeps. It makes sense. As they moved along the ridge, the tracks revealed subtle changes. Sometimes they moved with near perfect precision, each step shadowing the last, showing a body operating on habit rather than intent. At other points, the pattern broke where the wolf veered toward the slope, taking tentative steps, drawn by some scent or sound from town, then turning back. The prints formed loops and arcs, indecisive shapes on the snow. Eventually, the tracks reached the tree line leading down toward Michael's property, where the snow was thinner and prints clustered, spaced closer, as if the wolf paused longer than a moment. Michael followed Earl to the edge, looking out. His boots left new marks beside the old, and for a moment, the line between his life and the animals felt as thin as the snow layers separating them from the packed earth. Below the branches, he glimpsed his roof, driveway, and kitchen window. He recalled sitting by the pups box last night, the light spilling onto the snow, his outline visible through the glass to any watcher. The thought of the wolf standing there, nose full of unfamiliar scents, made Michael shiver and feel pain. "Did he know about us?" he asked softly. "He knows something," Earl answered quietly, as if the trees could carry their words. The den smells different, and the pattern changed. The pup's scent faded then disappeared. Now their smells in town, his scents nearby, along the paths, and the last place they shared his world was that hole under the tree. He's no fool. He knows some greater force reshaped his life, though he has no name for it. Michael considered names, human ones like shooters, rehabbers, conservation, as well as abstract ones like fate and chance, and the simplest, most honest one, us. Humans with guns, towels, bullet holes, and heat lamps entered his world and took first his mate, then his pups. From their view, it was acts of destruction and rescue wide apart, but, from his perspective, blending into one ongoing upheaval. Snow grew thicker, larger flakes spiraling lazily, but still accumulating. Earl tilted his head back, squinting at the sky, then looked back the way they came. "We've seen enough for today," he said. "He's still here, thinning but alive. He's curious and cautious. That's what I'll tell them. Anything else would be untruthful or manipulative, and we have enough of those." On the walk back, the wind picked up, blowing snow sideways and stinging their faces. Michael pulled his scarf higher and squinted against the cold, his boots nearly on autopilot. The cold was honest, a physical discomfort that just required thicker layers and faster steps. By the time they reached town, snow covered the streets softly, muffling sounds and making tires hiss instead of rumble. The town hall lot was filled with cars, more than Michael expected for a second meeting in 2 days. Seeing them gave him reluctant adrenaline, his body reacting like to an unprepared exam, knowing there are no right answers, only less or more honest ones. Inside, the hall felt warmer than yesterday. The heat increased to offset the dampness from coats and boots. People stamped snow off shoes, removed layers, and sat with tired efficiency, clearly weary of the topic, but obliged to stay. The air smelled of wet wool, coffee, and faint anxiety, perhaps intensified by the window showing only a white curtain outside, with the world beyond rendered abstract. Michael and Earl shook off snow and approached the front. Their quiet descent into conversation was more noticeable than the day before. A few heads, Jim's, Harold's, Jess's, turned immediately, eyes searching for clues in their expressions, as if the wood's secrets were already visible there. Hargrove stood again at the lectern, his tie slightly askew, eyes pink from little sleep and fluorescent light. He nodded slightly, acknowledging them. "Good," he said. "You're here. We'll begin right away. People are exhausted, eager to know if they'll sleep better tonight." A murmur of agreement spread, creating a strange sense of unity. Michael also sought a clear line between unease and peace, a decisive after to the unsettled before. Yet he knew, with painful clarity, no such boundary existed. Tonight's decision wouldn't silence the wolf's story, it would only distort it. Earl spoke first, as planned in the truck, his voice steady, describing the tracks. The thinner depth, hesitant movements near town's edge. The prints looping back like pacing in a small kitchen. He didn't exaggerate or omit, just laid the facts bare. Still alone, he stated plainly. He's still oscillating between where his world shattered, losing weight, but not yet desperate enough to approach or threaten. Curious and cautious about us, that blend is risky if handled wrong. With patience, he'll either deepen his range or find a new pattern not sitting on the ridge yelling. The question is whether we can tolerate this process. Then Michael stepped forward, wishing he could simply point at Earl and say what he said and sit down, but the town's gaze bore down differently now, knowing he carried the pups in his coat, drove them out, and returned empty-handed. He cleared his throat, felt it catch, then said, "We took the pups to a rehab center," sounding stark and formal in his own ears. A hillside place where they care for injured wild animals caused by our roads and traps. Medora now has them, but they're still at risk. She believes they have a chance if rescued in time, though nothing's certain. She'll raise them with minimal human contact. If they survive, she plans to release them far away in less populated areas. "Far from here," Jim said, his tone tense. "So we send wolves elsewhere and keep a male on our ridge. Is that your plan? To pass off the pups and wait for their father to wander off or get shot by hunters ignoring our permission?" Michael's anger flickered again, the same heat from when Jim bluntly dismissed their actions. "My plan," he said, struggling to sound steady, "was to prevent 3 animals from freezing in a known hole. Beyond that, we're improvising. There's no script for a wolf family surviving near a Vermont town that hasn't seen wolves in a century. Medora can do what we can't. She can keep them alive without turning them into dogs and reintegrate them into a world that might accept them. That doesn't resolve what's happening on the ridge or what was done by that creek, but it keeps 3 small hearts beating, and that matters." "It might not matter to you." Jess raised her hand, not like a student, but to cut through the noise. "What did she say about him? Is bringing them back even possible, or just something we tell ourselves to sleep?" Michael considered Medora's unwavering stare and blunt words about slim chances and separate stories. "She said it's theoretically possible," he answered. "Out west, some programs have released pups into dens that weren't theirs, and the wild adults took them in. But that's with mothers and packs in controlled wild spaces, not with a lone male on the verge of a town that already wants him dead. She believes the odds are low, but not zero. Trying that could result in dead pups, a wounded father, and an angrier town. I'm not dismissing the idea entirely, but with pups barely surviving and no one here trained for such a reunion, it's more about our wish for a perfect ending than what's best for them." His honesty felt like a loss of a softer part of himself, a cautious hope at the wood's edge, yet it was necessary to be truthful about potential consequences. "So we have a sad story," a hungry wolf, Harold said, rubbing his face, "and 3 pups sent to a hill sanctuary. I'm not unaffected. I'm not made of stone. My fence faces those trees, and I have a dog, grandkids, and a wife who jumps at every howl. We gave you 48 hours, what now? Do we wait until winter ends, hoping he gets the hint?" The room seemed to hum on the verge of something, filled with sleepless nights, small fears, and stirred compassion that grew complicated. Michael felt the weight of his response tightening in his chest, knowing that what he said next wouldn't end the conflict, but would shape its form. He thought of the wolf's tracks near the trees above, the hesitation in the snow, how the prints turned back instead of going down. He remembered the pups under Medora's care, struggling to swallow, and considered Millhaven the diner, gas station, school, town hall, this small human community embedded in a land with stories long before they arrived. Taking a breath, feeling the cold ridge air in his lungs, he moved closer to the front of the room, standing in that small space between Earl and himself, where human and wild kept touching, but could not fully separate.